Good morning, everybody. We are coming to you live from Hershey, Pennsylvania at the AACA Museum, Inc. And we have a very exciting program, an extension of our 75th anniversary of the Tucker automobile, which we had a grand celebration here in June. If you didn't hear about it, there's going to be some more videos of those things that we did here and all the attendees that shared the celebration anniversary with us. But today we have this great topic of the lost Tuckers and what happened to these vehicles that out of the 50 that aren't with us and the mystery surrounding them. And presenting today, we have great-grandson of Preston Tucker, Mike Tucker, as well as Mark Lieberman, our senior advisor to the Tucker Automobile Club. And they're great supporters of this place and these educational discussions. And we're going to kick it off to them.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been a topic that has been lamented and discussed many times over the decades. But what we're going to present to you today is a grouping of facts, addressing some of the rumors, the speculation, the conjecture, and most of all, clearing some of the fog away from what has actually happened to the lost Tuckers. 4 cars that are gone, but not forgotten. And we're going to begin this with Mike, and he will start us off with the first car that is gone.
I will, and I think kind of adding a little bit to that, we did the best we could with trying to figure out through all the documents and all the things what we think happened to these cars. Certainly, we're still learning, to this day, even up to yesterday. So I don't want to say that we have all the answers. I think we've tried to separate out where we've got documentation and some of the things that have been passed along throughout the years, and that's what took a lot of the time getting through this stuff. So. In a lot of cases, there may be other info we don't know, and I think in the Q&A section, we've got a few folks on that probably have some pretty good knowledge of some of this stuff. So if there's something you've got a question on or something that doesn't sound right, certainly bring it up. But this picture here is a picture of Tucker number 23. We're going to get into that one in a second, probably the saddest story that we know most of the story of, but I won't tell it yet, but certainly not the greatest picture in the world, and it gets worse from there. So we'll get into that in a minute, but we will start it with, hold on. Oh, wait, there we go. Tucker number, hold on a second. I got to minimize this window so I can see here. Okay. All right. So this is Tucker number 18, the first of the 4 cars that no longer exist. You'll see the photos aren't the greatest quality, but that's because there aren't that many of them, and they're the best ones we have. So starting off each car, we're going to talk about some of the details that we know, and then we'll get into early factory history, what we have documentation of, and then what happened afterwards. So this is Tucker 18. Tucker 18 had body number 9. It was Palomino beige originally, so one of the few cars, I don't want to say few colors you see now. A lot of the folks that had Palomino beige cars repainted them other colors. We did get lucky enough at the 75th to have number 28, which the Motorland Museum in Maine has. That is a Palomino beige car. So for those that attended that, you got to see that color. Interior on this car is beige, had engine 33517 and Y1 transmission, which we learned relatively recently were all serialized. So Y1 122 AF, and those numbers will become important in a little bit. This is one of the few cars we don't know the exact date it was completed. We don't have a document that tells us that. And then first sale date, we do know. There's a document, you'll see that. So this was sold on July 30th of 48 to Buffalo Tucker Sales in Buffalo, New York. So then getting into some of the early factory documentation, and I'll talk about it on this car, and then we'll show you on the later cars. It is amazing, the documentation that the company kept. Almost weekly inventories of the cars they had done, where they were, all kinds of notes on what happened to them. So we get a pretty clear picture of what happened to these cars, from roughly July of 48 to December of 48. So this inventory document we're looking at here is the first one from 7/23 of 48. You see the date up there on the top. 18 is listed. So it's already completed by this time. So we know it was completed before July 23rd. You can see the parameters there noted as the engine that we talked about, that the car is already in Chicago. I didn't post all of the individual weekly inventories, but I traced this one through. This is one of them. Every inventory from September to November of 48 shows this car in Buffalo, at Buffalo Tucker Sales. So this example here is 8/31 of 48. And then interestingly, as we get to the later documents, this is the last factory document before they started getting into inventorying for the bankruptcy auction. This is a 12/27 of 48 document. You see that 18 is interestingly back at the factory, and instead of saying Buffalo Tucker Sales, it says GEO McKinney, which we know is George McKinney, and that name will also, you'll hear that again in a second, and it helps us to connect some of these stories that came afterward. So the fact that this car was back at the factory is interesting, but it did not go through the auction because it was already sold. So you'll see on some of the other cars, when they're back at the factory at this time period, they end up in the auction. This one was not. So moving forward to after factory, this is a picture of 18, and Dave Kamek actually did some pretty good detective work on this. There's several photos and we'll go through them, but if you look in the background, you can pick out buildings and things like that. And he identified Daniel Chevrolet, and Daniel Chevrolet was in Orchard Park, New York. So Orchard Park, New York is about 8 miles away from Buffalo. Knowing the time period of this photo, knowing it's a beige car, and where this is, we can pretty confidently say that this is probably 18. We think 18 was then sold from that dealer to that George McKinney again of Bradford, PA. Bradford, PA is about an hour and 15 minutes south of Buffalo. So again, the distance makes sense. This is another photo of the car here, looking at it from the back. So again, you can see the beige color and some of the other features of 18. There was a rumor, and I saw this a couple times in some of the stories as we look through different letters people had sent into publications and things about this car, that it was vandalized and someone had dumped a paint or a can of red paint on the roof, and it went all over the hood and windows and stuff. So it's a story I saw more than once. So I assume it must be true from those multiple accounts, and they attributed it to a local Dodge dealer who wasn't happy about, I guess, Tucker's existing. So
imagine that.
Yeah. So this is probably the clearest photo of 18 that we have. That might be George McKinney in the driver's seat. You would think he'd be driving his own car. And then as we move forward here, as we move forward here, if you pan out on this, and I wanted to zoom in a bit on the car, but that's where you can start to see some of those dealership signs and things like that, where you can place this car in Orchard Park, New York. All right, so then where do we go from there? This is where the story gets worse. So this picture here, we think is Tucker 18. There's 3 stories of what happened to this car. They're pretty close. But the one we think is the most plausible, or at least a portion of it, is story number 1, that the car was totaled while being driven from Pittsburgh to Buffalo by a Tucker salesman. The accident was on Route 16 south of East Aurora, New York. And this photo here that somebody at the scene took, this photo actually walked into the museum in Ypsilanti many, many years ago. The gentleman was a bagger at a grocery store and had heard this accident happen and ran out and snapped a photo, and years later find out that it's this car. I do think this is probably the most plausible story, but I don't think it was a Tucker salesman. I think it was probably George McKinney, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The other 2 stories are, story number 2 is very similar, but instead of crashing into a tree, it crashed into a bridge abutment, and it's virtually split in 2. And then story 3 was it's hit by a train. I don't think that happened, but certainly it's a version that's out there. So I think a modified version of story number 1 is the one I think is plausible. I think the Tucker salesman comment might have come from a different car. So if you look at, there is factory documentation that Tucker 22 was crashed by a Tucker salesman in this area around this time. So I think that's where the salesman comment comes from. And I say that because there's a firsthand account, and I believe it was in Old Cars Weekly, if I remember right, that I was reading through. A gentleman had sent a letter in 1991 explaining that his neighbor his neighbor's uncle, whose name was George McKinney, which then connects it back to this story, had crashed his Tucker. It was stored in this garage. He looked in the window and could see, almost the front and the back of the car. So, it was in a position kind of similar to this photo that we see here. So I think that's probably the most plausible one. A couple things that Mark and I were looking at as we looked at these photos, some things that help us and some things that hurt us. So as we looked in detail at this photo, the color of the car on the right side bothered us a bit. It looks a little dark to be beige. Now, certainly it could be because it's a not great black and white photo. And then I noticed that it's missing that wind deflector that's on the window on the passenger side, and you see that on both sides of the car. So that made me start to question, like, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't 18. And then Bart pointed out, if we look at some of the tire wear on the passenger tire, because we know these photos would have been taken pretty darn close to each other, we do see the tire wear. You can see that's an early hubcap. So I think this is probably car 18, but certainly, down the road, as we often find, if there's some other person that comes out and has a different photo of this car further away and we find out it's not, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. But I do think that's probably the demise of 18. So what happens after this? The car starts to get split up. I don't have the individual stories of all these folks because they go on for a long time, but several owners owned parts of this car. Al Reinert, Les Schaefer, Stan Gilliland, George Ash, Chick DeLorenzo, Mark Lieberman, and Marty Mieres. So this is the front half of 18. I believe this photo is in Les Schaefer's backyard. Some of these other photos, you can see the back end of the. So I think that's probably Les Schaefer's house. This photo is really helpful because it's one of the nicest resolution photos. So we can take some of the little bits like where rust spots are and things like that and trace these parts in different pictures that we see. So it's pretty. Yeah. So yeah, you can see this car at this point pretty destroyed. If I move forward a little bit here, so that was at Les Schaefer's. We think either Les Schaefer or Al Reinert took the front end off of that car. So the fenders and hood and, well, not the fenders, I guess not the hood, the fenders were separated, and then it ends up being a cowl and a frame section. The fenders end up going into Dick Kuhn's collection, which is a picture right here. Dick was collecting parts over the years, and you'll see this picture again in 27 and some others where he was trying to assemble a car, never did, but he later sold those parts, and this is a picture of that auction. And then George Esch, which I'm going to go back on. I think the picture on the right side is George Esch's fancy 79 Trans Am with the Tucker front end on its way, we think to, or I'm sorry, not George Esch, Al Reinert. And then we think this is probably on its way to George Esch because we know George Esch took this and turned it into this, which is a frame that he was putting together to try to start building his own Tucker. This is a frame that still exists today, and we'll look at that in a second. But what perplexed us a little bit about this was if you saw the car cut in half and then you see this, where the heck did the back of this car come from, and how could this be 18? Magically, we found a letter from as we put presentation together, which was written from George Esch to David Kamek, talking about building this frame and the fact that he took the front end of 18 and welded it back together with the rear of car number or body number 55, which was one of the leftover bodies at the factory. So that's how this frame still exists. It's got early suspension in the front and an early configuration. The back of it is a later car, which is 55. So then what happens to this stuff? Fast forward a little bit more. This is the drivetrain. This picture is probably looks familiar to anyone that's been to the AACA. This is engine 33517 and Y1 transmission 122AF in the collection. And there's a picture there in the bottom right corner of those serial numbers on the transmissions. We did locate where those are, and it helps you to track, exactly which one this is. There's a letter that was in Old Cars Weekly again in the 1990s. A gentleman that had acquired this engine, and the story from him was shortly after the crash of 18, somebody salvaged the engine for a hot rod build with intentions to put a car together. Never did. Stored the engine and transmission for about 40 years. And in 1988, a gentleman named Lance Lewis happened upon this engine for sale. And shockingly, we found a photo of that he sent into Old Cars Weekly. So this is the same engine in 1988 that he purchased. And we've got the transmission as well here. So that's the Y1 transmission. Those two ultimately ended up in the hands of David Kamek and in the AACA collection. There's also a photo of the radiator and some of the other bits that were there. So that display all came from this car. The numbers are verified. It definitely is the drivetrain from 18. Fast forward a little bit more. We see that front end of 18 ultimately becomes the front end of Tucker continuation car number 52, built by John Schuler, using the parts from Dick Kuhn and the work of Brian Joseph. So that's the car there on the left side. I'm not exactly sure where that car ended up. I've heard it's in Jersey somewhere, but it was sold a couple of years ago at auction. And then that red frame, this is a picture actually at Mark's shop about, I don't know, Mark, 2 weeks ago or so, or a month ago?
Right.
Mark, Sean, and myself have acquired this frame, and we're not exactly sure what we're going to do with it yet, but still exists. And we were very, very delighted to find what the heck this thing is. So as part of putting this together, because it always perplexed us on why is this an early front frame? So the front is 18 and the back is 55. All right, so moving on to the next car. The next lost Tucker is Tucker number 23. This photo here looks like an unassuming vintage Tucker photo. I got these photos on Etsy, actually. Somebody sent me a link and said, hey, there's some vintage Tucker photos on Etsy. You should pick them up. And I did. They were very reasonable, not knowing that it was going to be the only vintage photos of 23. And I'll tell you how we know that in a second, but I'll go through the details here. So 23, body number 8. So you'll also notice this one varies a lot. So Tucker bodies and Tucker serial numbers don't necessarily match. Usually they're close. 18 and 23 are not. So you remember that 18's was body number 9, 23 is body number 8. So those ones for some reason varied quite a bit from the sequence that you would think they would be in. 23 was originally Royal Maroon, had a beige interior. Engine 33533, transmission 104A, completed on September 15th of 48. And then instead of being sold, it's assigned to a Tucker dealer in Rochester, New York. And you'll see that'll matter later. Cars that were assigned or sold on a note versus cars that were actually sold means they either end up in the auction or not. So that's a pretty important distinction to make later. So how do we know this car was completed on that day? Well, back to that documentation conversation and how just very detailed they were about documenting everything. This is the actual memo that Dan LeBeau sent to Preston Tucker and others about the completion of this car. He did this probably for most of the cars. We haven't found all of them yet. But I'd say maybe half of them we have this document, and you can see here it says serial number 23 completed on this day. Had an under seat heater and a radio, which is pretty neat. I do think there's a typo in this document that the engine noted is number 3. I don't think that's the case. I think it's 33. We've seen errors on these before where they were copying what was where. So I think that was a mistake made, and you'll see 33 carry through all the rest of the documents later. Then 15 days later, another memo from LeBeau to that same group again. 23 is getting some work done. They actually replaced the transmission with 107 and tuned the engine. So we find as we go through these documents, there is a lot of maintenance / rework being done on a lot of these cars, all the way up to late December of 48. So if you trace these, you can get just the super clear picture of all the things they did, which is pretty neat.
Mike, I'll jump in as well and say and emphasize how much documentation on all of this took place. They were fastidious about making sure that everything was documented. When they brought a car in and did work on it, there was an internal memo on it. When they I mean, even relatively minor things. When they would bring it in, they documented absolutely everything on these cars.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Agreed. All right. So I'm going to shift forward to an inventory document. Again, I'm not going to show you all of them, but 23 here first shows up on the October 6th inventory, already in Boston, Massachusetts. Same parameters there. It remained in Boston until at least November. We know that inventory says that. And then if we shift forward to the December inventory, this is where we see that car in Rochester, New York, and assigned to Rochester Tucker Sales. Now, what makes that assigned to part interesting, if we go forward to the last inventory created, which is this one on March 3rd of 49, and you will see the same inventory referenced in the bankruptcy documentation for what cars were for sale. This car, because it was not purchased, was part of the auction. So you can see there that it's located in Rochester, New York, and as of March, theoretically is available. So then what happens to this car? Well, it's sold at the bankruptcy auction. So you can see there that was held October 18th to 20th of 1950. Several cars along with parts, all the tooling, basically everything left is auctioned off in Chicago. Many of the cars note on the auction bill which number that it was. This one unfortunately doesn't, so it's just a Tucker sedan. However, through both Richard Jones and some other documentation that we've looked at, we think the buyer of this was Tarrant Sales and Service in Syracuse, New York, and it's one of those one of the lines you see in the middle of that document where it's just kind of hey, this is a repeat of the last line. That's what we think that was. Now, we also talked about how do we know that this car is 23. So I'm going to go through some of these photos here. So this first one here, so this is another one of those early photos that we so luckily happened upon. You can see here the front plate is a New York dealer plate. So that ties to the story of Tarrant Sales and Service being the buyer of this car. Here's another shot of the driver's side of the car. If you colorize this photo, I didn't. It looks not very good when you do, but you can see the red coming out. So we do think this car is maroon. And then the dead giveaway of why this car is 23. This car has a shot of the interior, and you see these door handles versus door buttons. So every other Tucker that most of us are aware of has interior door buttons, not interior door handles. There are two cars that did not have door buttons, number 26 and number 23. We know this isn't number 26 because if you look over on the right side of the steering column, you see a pre-select there, not the Tucker-matic. So that narrows this down to it has to be 23. Strangely enough, the turn signal stock there, which there's many different ones used on cars throughout the run of 51. Two cars have that stock, and it's 23 and 26. So we can pretty confidently say this is car number 23 and the only vintage photos that we know of that exist. All right, so then what happens after that? 23 ends up in the hands of William Waldkirch of Niles, Ohio. In every document I see, it's really emphasized that it was conveyed to him and he didn't pay for it. I don't know why that's important. I'm sure there's a super strong story, an interesting one about why. But he ends up storing the car in a shed in Ocala, Florida, 66 to 74. Richard Jones, who is a very prominent early member of the Tucker Club and you know, did so much to support these cars back when they weren't as prominent as they are today. He and William got together and made a deal to do some work on the car. So the car went to Richard Jones's house in 74 and 75. That's in Orange Park, Florida. That's where this picture was taken. Unfortunately, they had a disagreement and some legal things ensued. Waldkirch ends up taking the car from Richard's house and storing it in an Allied Vans warehouse. That was in Deland, Florida, and that took place in March of 1975. Now, we also know some of the parts of the car remained at Richard Jones's house, which we'll see in a minute here on how those ended up or where they are today. But this is where the story gets not so good. So let me show you a couple more photos here. So this is Richard Jones's house as well. That's the back of 23. You see the front end here. This bumper in this configuration ends up being important later because we know this bumper actually survived, and we can trace the components that it doesn't have to a bumper that shows up later. A couple other photos here. So you see again, this is later at Richard's house. You can see that on the left side, it's got a door handle, not a door button. So certainly it's 23 and helps us tie that previous photo back to being this car. And then on the right side here, you can see some royal maroon paint there in the door jamb. So, and that same turn signal stalk. So these are certainly 23 and then help us, tie these whole chains together. All right. So here's where the story gets darker. All right. So in May of 1979, the Allied Vans warehouse where the car is stored catches fire, and it is a raging fire that is so hot it ends up destroying the car. Later, it then, and I'll tell you that in a second, on what ends up happening to the car. But this is a photo. As Mark and I were kind of sorting through these, we did notice there's a progression of these photos, and this one's actually a later photo. So right after the car burned, it was a more complete car than this. Richard ends up salvaging some things off the car, and this, I think, is right before it went into the crusher. But you can see here, no deck lid, no engine, no transmission, no bumper, no grill, things like that. Couple other photos here. So you can see on the left side, this we think is after salvage as well, and shortly before its demise. No wheels again, no trim. So on the right side,
shame.
Yeah, on the right side here, you can see the dash parts are still on. So those are some of the parts that Richard mentions taking off. So we think this is before salvage. A couple others here. This is the engine. So I talked about the fire being really hot, so hot that it melted the aluminum portions of the engine. So on the right side, that's a picture of the pile of aluminum that melted out of the car. And on the left side, that's the engine. There's a picture, I didn't put it in here, but of the heads. And basically the right side is half melted, and that's where all that came from. So unfortunately, pretty severe fire. Another couple shots here. So left side, that's the passenger side of the car after salvage. And then the driver's side of the car on the right side. Prior to salvage, you can see a wheel poking out there in the back. So I think that's when Richard Jones was doing as much as he could to get parts off of this car. And then last two here. So probably the best pre-salvage picture we have is the back of 23. You can see the radiator and the engine are still installed there, and the wheels are still on it. And then the very last photo of the car as it's getting sucked into the crusher. So just the very front end. So probably the saddest photo we have. All right. So then what happens to this car? We've got letters back and forth between Richard Jones and David Kamek, where Richard's pretty descriptive about the things that he did or didn't do to this car. So he did keep many of the chrome components before the car went to the warehouse. So a lot of that survived. He kept the body tag, which is on the right side here. So this is the serial number, and it would be on the cowl of the car. That is in the AACA collection. So you can go see that there. And then you see here, I didn't pull the whole letter, but he talks about the wheels, the flywheel, the hubcaps, the dash stainless, and many other parts that he salvaged from this car. This picture is also at the AACA. This is the rear suspension from 18 that Richard salvaged. Interestingly, and Mark and I were looking at these pictures, if these are original suspension arms, this is the only car that has those suspension arms. They are unique. We're not exactly sure why they're different, but they are. So the car, we end up finding that 23 did have several unique features that other cars didn't have, which is unfortunate that it's not around anymore. And then this picture here is the Y1 transmission that was salvaged from 23. This ended up being sold to a gentleman named Gene Clark, who owned Tucker 21 for, gosh, like 67 years or something like that. Mark recently acquired that car, and this transmission came with it. We haven't gotten to the point yet of trying to find the serial number, but we think it's probably on there. It's just going to take a little bit more detective work, but we think this is the Y1 from Tucker number 23. All right. We are now going to transition over to Mark, and he is going to talk about Tucker number 27.
27 is also a bit of a sad story. Not quite as sad as 23, but nevertheless, really interesting in terms of how components of 27 live on to this day. In this particular photograph, you see Eddie Offutt sitting in the now crashed, rolled car number 27. You can see while the car has sustained major damage to it, it is still largely a car, and the passenger compartment is well intact. This is car number or body number 27. It was originally waltz blue. Contained engine number 33522 and the Y1 transmission of 105A. Interestingly enough, the car and several of its surviving components managed to retain that original color. And since this car was wrecked so early in its life, really no modifications or changes took place on the vehicle over the years. The car was completed on the same day as car number 1023, you can see in this document, and it was in the possession of the engineering department and shown on the company inventory. It was one of 7 automobiles that underwent endurance testing at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and suffered the wreck during that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the wreck and the damage it sustained and how that was actually a good thing in the next few slides. The car was sold in the bankruptcy auction, and it was sold to Ezra Schliff at the time. Ezra was actually a pivotal person in Tucker history, as he purchased quite a number of cars and parts and was really a pivotal guy in making sure that the legacy continued on. Here you can see in this document that
just talked about, Mark.
I'm sorry?
That's the one you just talked about. I'll go farther forward. Sorry.
Thank you.
I was behind you.
No problem. You can see some details on the other side of the rolled car in this photograph here, the crushed rear fender, the other door, which sustained significant damage, like on the passenger side. And you'll see that this vehicle traveled a total of 1,443 miles at Indy prior to rolling twice, as a matter of fact, with Eddie Offutt at the wheel. Offutt wasn't injured in the crash, though he did sustain a bump on his elbow. And the details of that crash were written in great level of detail in order to document what had happened. It notes specifically that the cause of the crash was due to vapor lock from running aviation high-octane fuel in the car. As a result, the engine didn't perform correctly. It slid, blew out a tire, and then rolled twice, landing in the infield. But amazingly enough, the car was able to fire up and move again under its own power. But here is the really critical component of this. This could have been an absolute disaster for the Tucker Corporation. Had the driver, Eddie, been killed, had he sustained major injuries, had there been other significant problems or destruction to the car? No, none of that occurred. This actually turned out to be a really good thing because the car did exactly what it was engineered to do. The safety windshield popped out of it. The passenger compartment remained intact. The rubber padded dash did exactly what it was supposed to do. And you see in this photograph on the left, Eddie is behind the wheel of the now crashed car. You'll notice that his right arm, his elbow, is bandaged, as documented in that previous letter that you saw in the last slide. He sustained a bruise on that elbow from the crash, and that was the extent of it. You see the windshield popped out. You can see the weather strip molding hanging loose. But if you look around that passenger compartment, you see everything is well intact. That car was as safe as the Tucker Corporation was claiming it was going to be. And even though this car contained no seat belts, Eddie Offutt remained largely uninjured. And had this been another automobile of the time, who knows what would have happened to him. You can see in the photograph on the left, the deflection in the rim. from that left front tire, and that poor hubcap that was never the same after that.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, in these areas, you can see that spot on the rim. Also, take a look at how that fuel filler door is sitting on the car, very, very high on the fender, and that's pretty unusual. Though these did sit rather high up top, that was something that Mike and I noticed yesterday in reviewing these slides once again. That's at really tall on the top of that front fender. So here we have another photo of the car. Russ Brownell and Ezra Schliff installed 27's interior and other small parts in Tucker number 2. This was an interesting story, as well as when Russ Brownell purchased number 2, that car was largely disassembled. And basically, he went out to Ezra's place, assembled the automobile, including this interior and other small parts, in 1951, and drove it back to California. There's a whole handwritten letter that he chronicled his travels with, and I wrote about that once in the Tucker Topics, and it was a very interesting read as he suffered some real challenges during that trip back of building the car and driving it back to his home. Ezra sold the remains of 1027 to Nick Jenin. Nick Jenin is another milestone fellow in Tucker's history with his traveling Fabulous Tucker show. And he had lots of cars and parts and so forth. Another man that was really committed to the preservation of the legacy of Tucker. Nick later sold what the remains of 27 to David Kamak, along with number 1026. The interesting thing about this was when Dave Kamak purchased 26, he purchased a number of things with it. Number 27, the remains of 27 was one of those, along with the van that that Nick Jenin used to take around and travel with, that said Fabulous Tuckers on the side of it. While David had no particular use for the remnants of 27 or the van, he sold both of these items, which is interesting because David was not a guy to sell any Tucker parts. He kept everything for throughout his life, and then ultimately was generous enough to donate them to the museum, and that's how we have the collection that we do. So this was a really pretty rare occurrence, and he must have felt that there was nothing that he could do with either of those two items. So David sold number 27 to Stan Gilliland, and then parts went everywhere. They sold bits and pieces of that car in order to keep other cars running and operating. And according to Richard Jones, these pieces were used on quite a number of cars. Rear doors were used on 1051C, Carlo Di Lorenzo's car. Front bumper, radiator support, glove box door. Those all were put on car number 1050. But interestingly enough, those parts were scavenged off of 1027 while it was still at the factory, because at that point in time, they were running out of parts. And so it was a lot easier for them to utilize components off of 1027 rather than fabricating additional parts, because they were scrambling to get the last cars fully assembled. In these photographs, you can see on the left the circle around the front bumper of 1050. You'll notice on the right, the upper photograph, that's the rear panel of the glove box door. Both the rear panel and the front panel of that glove box came out of 27. And in fact, they had on the front panel, once we removed the fabric from it, you could see the original waltz blue paint and some hand chalk marks on that panel as well. Interestingly enough, on the reverse side of this, there was a hashtag or a number sign with the numbers 1050 beneath it. So you can see that they had removed it, and had earmarked it to go on 1050, which it ultimately did. In the photograph below, you'll see the number 27 on the engine cover latching tray. So this piece also was salvaged out of number 27, and it is the plate that holds that engine cover down and in place. Here's a photograph of 1052C, the continuation car that used to belong to John Schuler and was constructed by Brian Joseph. And quite a number of components from 1027 were used in the construction of this car. Here we have a photograph that we took just a few days ago of the passenger side door. Both passenger and driver's door survived today of 1027 in their original paint. And if you compare the scratch marks, the bends, the dents, there's absolutely no question that this is a sad but living tribute to what that car went through and the history of 1027. On to 1042. Now, Mike mentioned to you earlier in his presentation that we are learning things all the time. And as we were preparing for this presentation for you guys, we were still wrestling with what photos exist of 1042, if any, and where can we, find pictures of this car, because we had drawn certain conclusions over the years. 42 is our biggest mystery of all of these because it, largely has disappeared in its entirety. Well, this particular photograph that you see in front of you holds some of that mystery that we thought was resolved and then categorically dismissed that. So just before we hit the facts on that, we'll go over the basics. 1042 had body number 42. It was a royal maroon car. That's going to come and be an important component of the discussion in the slides ahead. Beige interior, engine number 33541, and then possibly 33531. I will explain why that is important in the story as well. And then we had long believed that this was going to be the second Tucker-Matic car. And I think that we'll have some reason to question that in this portion of the presentation. Well, let's look closely at these two cars that are in front of us on the screen. We believed that this front car, this dark car, very possibly a royal maroon car, was 1042. And the reason why we thought that was back here where you see that circle all the way to the left. You see what looks to be potentially the unusual transmission mount for a Tucker-Matic. Now, we can't say categorically that this was a Tucker-Matic transmission mount, but what we can say for sure is that that was an unusual addition to the configuration back there. And whether it was welded in at that point in time or whether it was set there as part of moving the body around, that's still a bit of a mystery. But as a result of that, we had concluded that this was likely number 1042.
For about 10 minutes, right?
I'm sorry?
For about 10 minutes, right?
For about 10 minutes, right. Right. And then we started saying, okay, well, what else do we see on this? Well, we notice the car doesn't have any ashtrays. Well, that's not right because these later cars all had ashtrays. So that was a question that made us look closer. Then we looked at the front chassis. That's definitely an early front chassis on this. That eliminated the possibility of this car being 1042.
Yeah, and I think we actually landed, because we think it's a maroon car, no ashtrays, which ended at car number 12.
Right.
no, this isn't number 3. This is likely 12, right?
Correct. And with the car behind it, well, we've got a light colored car that could be car number 13. It's possible it could be car number 11, but for sure, the likelihood of the maroon car being car number 12 is excellent.
Mm-hmm.
So speculation continued. Where else can we find a photograph of 1042? Well, you know, we put arrows here next to the dark cars in the lineup. The conclusion was none of these are number 42. And in fact, as you'll see in the documents ahead, it's very likely that 1042 was really just a roller and not a running driving car, which is what you see a lineup here of the running driving cars. Well, we looked at this particular photograph. Well, could this have been number 1042? Well, upon close examination, you can see the engine that's in this will tell us categorically it isn't. This is engine number 1 you see in the back of this car, identified by the long snout where the balancer would be on the front of the crank pulley. This is definitely engine number 1. That is on display in the museum and was part of the KMET collection. Definitely not car number 42. Looking deeper into the mix, well, okay, here's another car in the front lineup. Could this have been? Well, that is a later chassis, so I guess it's a possibility. If you look back further, there's 2 other cars back there that are one up high and one down low. Could either of those have been the construction of 42? It's possible, but I want to take a second here and I want to do a quick shout out to Robert DeSantis for getting us some of these really fantastic, never seen before plant photos that his father took when his father was a Tucker dealer. And these are some incredible bits and pieces of insight as to what that factory was really looking like during its early days. Over here, again, our search continued. Do we have anything here for 42? 2 cars up high, 1 car that is a dark car. If you look at the suspensions on both of these cars, they're both early cars. That's the early slab style suspension. Neither of those are 42.
Yeah, I think the other thing we saw was the lack of the bracing on the firewall as well. So these are definitely early cars, right?
Right. Good point. Yeah, the early cars don't have the ribs in the and braces in that front cowl area, and that comes into play in the later cars. So between that, the early suspension, we knew that these were later cars. You can see that bracing in these cars in the photograph. These are obviously later cars. So the rear one, that one does have an ashtray, you can see. It's a dark car, maybe too dark. That could well be a black car. And the ribbing and structural supports on that front cowl. So
I think this is probably the most likely to be 42, but again, looks a little bit dark. So probably not, but.
Right. I mean, this could well be 30.
Yeah,
or
30
or 41.
Yep.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So in factory completion documents, we see that no transmission was installed, but that the car had engine number 33541 in it. And on December of 48, inventory documents still note that the car was absent transmission. You see here, along with many other cars towards the end of the run, they say hold for transmission. Now, we saw initially when these cars were first built, the Tucker 48s, they were first using the Cord transmissions. Those were quickly replaced by Tucker's version, the Y1. But Tucker's vision for this was for all of his cars going forward to be Tuckermatics. And so I think that you see towards the end here, so many cars waiting for transmissions. They could have theoretically, they could have built more Y1s. They could have used the Cord transmissions that they had pulled from other cars. No, they wanted these cars to have Tucker-matics, and unfortunately, they just never got far enough to be able to do that. In March of '49, in the inventory, you can see that there's a note for the cars with no engine. And here again, you've got the car number 42 in building number 4 with no engine. So the idea that this car was a finished vehicle, I think we've pretty much debunked. It is very likely that this car was without engine or transmission at the actual sale. And it's very possible that the car was sold with a separate engine and transmission. And perhaps that's how the story evolved, that this car had a Tucker-matic. Perhaps it was just this car had a Tucker-matic with it in the sale. And one of the things that sort of points to that is this shuffling of engines around and shuffling of transmissions and all these notations about no transmission in there. Engine 33541 that was originally slated for this car is now installed in engine 34, which was done at the factory. So they had pulled the engine back out of this car, put it in engine number 34, and so this car was left without an engine and without a transmission at that point in time. And we have found no supporting documentation that a Tucker-matic transmission was ever fitted to this car at the factory. So number 42 is believed to have been purchased at the Tucker auction by Harry Aldrich for $4,000. That's another clue for us that this likely came with a separate engine and transmission, very possibly a Tucker-matic transmission, because he paid so much for the car. If this was just a roller absent an engine and transmission, then it's very unlikely that this would have commanded a $4,000 price tag at the auction, as we see other cars brought well less. You'll see that there are several histories about 42, and these are all worth noting. Stories include that Aldrich sold number 42 to either Ezra Schliff or a Tennessee used car dealer. Another story that 42 was abandoned by the Mississippi River in Memphis, Tennessee, after being stolen and vandalized. One of the other stories that we actually have some documentation on is that there were raffle tickets sold to Bash a Tucker. This was for $1. You got to take a sledgehammer to a Tucker. And unfortunately, 1042 was the victim of being bashed to death. There are flyers out there. Mike has seen them. I've seen them. I don't happen to have one. There may be something in the archives that we haven't pulled out of the club archives. I remember seeing something in there. We've got to dig through that a little further, and maybe one of you guys in the audience have one of these pamphlets that were circulated. But that's what that one was all about. The sad.
We know what happened. Oops, sorry. We know what happened, but we don't know that car was 42, right? It might have been, and stories are that it was, but we're not sure. We know the event happened.
Right. And then the last version of this was a police officer purchased the remains following the Bash a Tucker event, and he stored them in a rental property in Tennessee where he had tenants. The tenants became very disgruntled with this derelict car on the property that they were renting. They called the scrapper, and off to the scrapyard it went. Engine number 33531 and the Tucker-matic are on display at the AACA Museum. But there are some hints to that, even though it was believed, and David believed that this was the package that came with 42. There are hints that it didn't. One of the most glaring is the bell housing. The bell housing on 33531 is a regular transmission bell housing, suitable for a Y1 or a Cord transmission, but incompatible with the Tucker-Matic. When David Kamek purchased this package from Bill Goodwin, it's most likely that Bill Goodwin shared the story that these were 42's components, and perhaps they were along sometime when the car was sold, but very unlikely that they were actually in the car.
Well, and we also know 33531 was sold as a separate engine at the auction. So if it did end up in 42, somebody put it in afterward, right? It wasn't at the factory, right?
Correct.
All right.
So there we have it. Let's open the gallery up to questions, and let's see what we can do for you guys.
Yeah, I think one other point on this photo. So this is another Robert DeSantis photo. I had never seen a good picture of the front of the factory, and through various things that we'd been doing to try to figure out what it looked like. It was crazy to me that we hadn't. We had some pictures of it when it was the Dodge plant, but never a photo like this. So really, really cool that his, I think it was his father or his grandfather took this shot. So we get the front of the factory. Pretty darn cool.
But this along with several other photos that they had done. That he had taken at the time, since those were not published photos and hadn't been circulated publicly, these had gone, unseen and unnoticed, and he was kind enough to bring them forward, allowed us to copy them, and we're grateful for being able to capture this piece of history as a result. Thank you.
Rob, I think back to you, right?
Yeah. We're going to make sure I have our Lost Tucker screen shot up here. And before we do that, let's go back to our questions. Let's see if I can get back there. We have a participant here that named Paul. Oh, his chat just went away here. Meeting group chat. I'm sorry. I'm going to start with my own question here, and while you're answering it, I will go back to our couple participants that posted things in the chat. You have mentioned other cars here, like number 55 or 51C or 52C. I know C is continuation, but I think a lot of our participants, especially the ones in House and Museum today, are thinking, hey, we thought there were only 50 cars. How many, is there a known number of continuation cars that were purchased with factory parts that were sold at the auction?
So I'll start by how many bodies we think there were. I believe, Mark, we've landed on a 58, right?
Correct.
Bodies. So the number 51 that you always hear about cars is correct. We think bodies 52 through 58. Well, I don't know that we don't think, we know they were left over. They were certainly either sold at the auction or left outside the factory for quite a while. Those bodies ended up being purchased as a group and then ultimately ended up with Stan Gilliland and went all over the place. But that's where those other cars come from. Some of the continuation cars utilize that. So like Carlo De Lorenzo's car used one of those, I'll say, very complete bodies. The challenge with those bodies is most of them sat outside for many, many, many years. They were raw steel when they were acquired. They are extremely rough. So we do have a lot of photos of those things sitting in several different folks' backyards, but to a point of rust where they're almost unusable. So if you remember back the pictures of those frames and stuff that we shared from number 18, the reason 55, only the half of it was left. That car rusted so bad that those frame rails fell off. So as some of those bodies traded hands, I think I want to say one or two of them were used in continuation cars. The other continuation cars used various components. So of the ones we know of, 1051 is probably the most complete. I believe that used body 54. That's the one Carlo De Lorenzo built. Body 55 we talked about for a second here. There's another body 57, which Mark, I'll let you talk about that one. It's my least favorite. And then other components, but things like 1052C that we talked about, that was John Schuler's car. The chassis of that car is actually the test chassis number 2, the front end of 18. So all kinds of different components, and De Lorenzo did the same thing. So there's 2 continuation, or I guess 3 continuation cars that I'd say are, utilize Tucker parts. Some use those later bodies, but a lot of them are using components of the cars that we talked about here to end up being complete cars. But 58 bodies as far as we know.
How body is one thing. What do they utilize for a frame then?
There is no, so Tucker is a unibody. So when you say frame, like that chassis we showed, is really the body portion cut off because it was so rusted they couldn't use it, and then it become, like you would do on like a Beetle, where people will cut off the body and call it a frame. It's not a frame; it's the bottom of the unibody, and then the frame rails kind of stick out from either side.
It's basically a substructure. What Tucker had done. And interestingly enough, the tubs were all made by an outside firm in Grand Rapids, I think it was. So he had contracted for these tubs to be made. And so it's the center section of the body and the understructure that provides the strength of the overall unit. There is no frame. There's some subframe extensions that exist underneath this car, but they're not bolt-on, so to speak. It's all part of that overall structure. It's like building a bridge. It's only strong when it's all together. And that's exactly how this thing worked.
Oh, great. Thanks for that explanation. We're going to go to, we have a comment from Paul, who either is or was a resident of LA, California, who is a big Tucker fan and said he had seen some as a 13-year-old in person, and now he is 40. But he is giving us kudos as well as asking the question, is there any way that you know of the percentage of private-owned Tuckers currently versus museum-owned ones?
Not a number I've calculated, but I'd say half and half, maybe, Mark?
Well, yeah, and we know where all the cars are, well, except for what it remains of 42 necessarily, but the interesting component is that they're all known. It seems like there's about a 50-50, but there's kind of a gray area to that because a lot of the private owners have their own museums, so that's kind of a gray area in between. Very few of these any longer remain in just private guys' garages any longer. There are relatively few, and that used to be the majority of them, and that's how so many of these things survived, is people loved the cars, took care of them, and kept them at home.
Yeah, it's a good question and tough one to answer, and I think you answered it well. Some people do have their own private collection that you would consider a museum, so the rare stuff gets treated that way.
If you're in LA, make sure you go to the Petersen and see Tucker number 30, because it's a special car and one of the Indy cars. So I see April's on. Her and I had some time to go look at that car together, and the museum's outstanding there too. So certainly go visit Tucker number 30 if you get a chance.
Petersen is a fabulous place. So Barry Young asked the question, if 1042 wasn't the victim of the Basher Tucker contest, were there any other candidates? Or what were the other candidates? Very good question.
Yeah, there's other cars that could be. So we know there's other cars that got in significant accidents. I mentioned Tucker number 22. So we know that one was heavily damaged in an accident back in 48 by a Tucker salesman. That could have been the car. Others that had either significant damage or don't exist. It could have been one of those extra bodies. It could have been, it wasn't really clear on the story because all we have is like a picture of a raffle ticket that says you can go do this. Could have been a body, could have been a complete car. Mark, do any other come to mind that you could think that it might be?
Nothing that would have been damaged to that extent. So, in my opinion, it would have to be either 42 or one of the remaining rusty tubs.
Right.
Because and we've got a firsthand account from now the late Stan Gillahan that he was involved in the restoration of 22 after it had been wrecked. And so that was clearly a car wreck, right. and not a mob wreck. So I think that yeah, it's most likely that if that story holds as truthful, that would have been the fate of 42.
Gotcha. All right, thank you for that question and answer. So Dr. Peter Zabritsky asked a couple questions. I'm going to try to show us online here with screen sharing the answer to the first one about the dealerships that were in the Pittsburgh area, because we have a interactive map that we have on display here in our exhibit at the AACA Museum, and I will show that map here if I can control my screen sharing for 1 second. But his other question, while I get that up, was about the evolving assembly line, and there are so many differences on suspension, early and late cars. Like, you guys have documented a really great amount of assembly line changing, and without getting too deep or off subject, how do you keep track of this evolving assembly line changes stuff, and where are these major differences and why?
Really complex spreadsheets that I don't want to say complex, but I guess really long. Every time we find one of these things, and I mean, we find new ones, gosh, every time we talk, Mark, right? Yeah. Of, hey, this car had this car had this, and you got to be really careful with these things, because it's, as you're restoring one of these cars and you're looking at, hey, this looks different than this. This must obviously have been changed by somebody later. The unfortunate part of I'll say the first 40 years or so of Tucker history is the cars weren't worth that much. So to do things that you would have to do to maintain really a prototype vehicle where you're making all the parts because they don't exist, the value of the car didn't make sense. So as time went on, a lot of the folks that were using them and keeping these cars going were doing whatever they could to keep them going. So if the suspension failed, a lot of them cut it out and put something else there. So as we're going through these, never really kind of landing on, okay, well, this is different, so it's definitely wrong. Every single time that question comes up, particularly if, it's a vintage part, we all get on the phone and like, okay, well, this car has this and this has this. Some of the things you can use, if cars in sequence, so like 32, 33, 34, the first thing you'll jump to is, okay, well, what cars were around it? What parts did those cars have? And what do we think changed there? Sometimes you'll get lucky there. A lot of times you can go back to the dates on the blueprints. So, we talked about documentation. The AACA has thousands and thousands and thousands of the original Tucker blueprints, and all of those blueprints have dates on them. So we can go through where there's an assembly blueprint of the suspension and there's 25 different versions of it. Those different versions will reference different parts. We can then take those dates, compare them to the dates the cars were completed, and figure out what parts are right. And then lastly, there's also a pretty significant amount of vintage photos out there. So we'll pull up, factory photos or photos we know are from the 50s from whatever car, and try to, connect the dots on those things. And then like you said, to keep it straight, we call ourselves the Tucker dorks because we probably remember way too much about individual cars, but where we don't, we do document that and try to keep that. Someday we'll get it more organized, and we always talk about that, but we're not to that point yet.
Well, and another component of this as well is that keep in mind, these cars were evolving in real time. They had a very compressed period of time to make this car work. And so while it was an assembly line, so to speak, there was also a real close connection with the engineering team saying, uh-oh, this isn't working the way we want it to. Let's change things. And I'll give you some examples of something that you know, you would see 5 cars in a row, and you look at the rear torsioelastic suspension and you say, oh, it's all torsioelastic tubes, they're all the same. Well, you saw a photograph of 23 suspension that has a unique trailing arm. That was put on there for a reason. The length of the tubes varied. Some tubes were longer, some tubes were shorter, as they were trying to dial in both ride and handling. So there were variations that took place along the way in order to make this car a better car. And some of these were happening very, very rapid. If you take a look at the front suspension on Tucker number 1, it used a torsioelastic tube up front on this wild set of linkages. It's almost like a Rube Goldberg device that was designed in order to create that front suspension to work. Well, they quickly determined that that was not going to happen and be refined fast enough for them to get these cars on the road. So they went to the slab style front suspension. Well, that carried through car number 25. That was the last one of that. But along the way, they were making changes. There were lots of changes that happened on the engines too along these ways. So,
yeah, sorry, Mark. I think calling it an assembly line, in the sense of what you would think the assembly line would, you know, what an assembly line is today or even back then, it was probably more of a prototype line, because certainly each car was given, you know, its own special attention. There wasn't like a pile of parts they're pulling from that are all the same. Every single car, to an extent, is different.
Yes, and we saw things changing in cooling tubes and things changing in terms of radiator position and things changing. So all of this stuff, there are 50 hand-built prototypes. You can't take a door off one and put it on the other. You can't take a deck lid off one and put it on the other. In many instances, even seat configurations change. We talked about what they did. We've got the notes on Tucker number 26. They altered the seat spring rate. They altered the seat height in order to try to find a more comfortable driving position. So all of this changed. Each of these cars are their own specific animal.
Very cool. I'm going to jump back here and answer quickly without getting too far off subject. The question of what dealers were in the Pittsburgh area. And here I have called up our interactive map, which is in part of our Kamek Tucker exhibit display. And I will tell you the ones that are available or were registered and ready to go. I have to move one screen here. Bear with me. In the Pittsburgh area. So it looks like we had a car that was sold at Pittsburgh Tucker sales. Mark, you probably know off the top of your head which one it may have been.
No, I'm good, but I'm not that good.
Okay. Well, there was one of the Tuckers was actually sold at that dealership in Pittsburgh. Other ones that were near Pittsburgh were Wilkinsburg, Avalon, and Carnegie. So it looks like we had one registered Pittsburgh dealership that we know of to answer that question.
And Pittsburgh was car number 4.
Oh, okay. There's your answer. Very good.
Thanks,
good
Mike.
question. Good question and answer. Let me get back to our chat window here and see which are I'm bouncing around here. Sorry, I'm losing track. I'm going to stop the screen share just for a minute to get our next. We always have our longest distance award. Vincente from Spain, who loves the museum and loves Tuckers, is here. So hello and greetings from Spain. Let me go down through here and grab it. So is Tucker number 30 on display again? And that is a question from Cheryl T. For a while it was in storage. So Tucker number 30, is it available to be seen somewhere?
I think the last time that I was at the Petersen, it is there on the 2nd floor, I believe. It was down in the vault for a while. So if you got lucky enough to get a tour of down there, you could go see it. The first time I saw the car, it was down there. But as far as I know, And I don't know if anybody else has been there recently. I was at the Peterson, gosh, maybe 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and it's on display. So you can go see it.
That's great. We're going to probably wrap this up. I'm going to do a final screen share here.
There's one question about the rolling at Indy.
Oh, so we know, where was that, John?
Was it the one that said was it the only car that rolled at Indy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So
April
yes,
asked us that. Hi, April.
Yeah, it was the only car that rolled at Indy. However, there were other cars that had issues. So 26, we know, blew a tire. And if you look at the document that talks about 27's experience, they reference that 26 blew a tire but did not roll because it did not have aviation fuel and this vapor locking issue that caused it to roll over. So it is, as far as we know, it was the only car that rolled over and had significant damage, but it wasn't the only car that had, issues. And if you look at those documents and even the video, there's a really good copy of it on YouTube that you can watch. You'll see all kinds of cool little stuff. So like Tucker number 30 is the car they used, we know, to test the white wall tires that they had planned on using. And if you watch the video, you can see that the black car in the video, which is 30, has white walls on the front but not on the back. So some pretty interesting tidbits that you can find. And as we talked about, the documentation's amazing. So, there's a 10-page report of what happened. There's reports on every single car, and all the little things that occurred. So, it's really neat to go through that. But as far as we know, that's the only one that sustained, say, major damage.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we thank you all for your questions and our great answers, because we all love as much insight as Mike and Mark give us on this history, on this subject of a rare car. See, I always get a chuckle. It's like how incredibly rare these cars are, but how incredibly well documented everything was. And here we are decades later listening to you folks as you have put this story together.
Did you have a question?
No, you answered it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take a second to tell everybody what's coming to the museum. We have muscle cars past and present. That's going to start. It's actually already begun, but the official kickoff is this Friday, the 17th and 18th, and we'll go through the end of April to see a great combination of past and present muscle cars. And we had started to feature that with old and new Dodge Challengers that are in the Members First Gallery. And we also have an Austin Healey club here that is taking over the Williams Klein Gallery. And yes, we discovered we can get 4 cars into that one Williams Klein Gallery, and they're viewable here now. We also will have our next education discussion on December 16th, I believe.
Saturday at 11.
Saturday at 11 o'clock. And that will have, what's Mr. Donahue's first name?
Dan, I think.
Dan Donahue, a race car driver and representative of Porsche Automobiles, and his ascent up and down Pikes Peak. And that will be extremely interesting. So make sure you watch and sign up for that next one. And if you like what you see and you like what you hear, please visit us and give us a donation and come to the museum here in Hershey. And we thank everybody for being here. We want to thank the attendants or our host, Mark Lieberman, Senior Advisor to the Tucker Club of America, as well as Mike Tucker, great grandson of Preston Tucker, other great supporters of this museum. So with that, we will adjourn and thank everybody for being here today, and enjoy the rest of your day, and happy motoring.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Good job.
Take care now.
That was outstanding.
These guys are outstanding.
Yeah.
That's why it was outstanding. They're
Really
fabulous.
informative.
Yep. Thank you, Mike and Mark.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Happy to do it for you guys.
All right. Have a great day. We'll see you.